everybody, Marcel Harding here, and welcome to my channel, Marcel's Harding Art. This is going to be a talk-over video of a still life I've just recently done. It took me a couple of half days. It took me about 3 hours to paint. So I did one session over an hour and a half, and then a second session the next day over an hour and a half. It's just a basic still life. Now this is an A4 size acrylic paper, just attached to a board with masking tape. And I'm using a large brush here, about a size 14 flat, and I've mixed my own black up with ultramarine blue and burnt umber. Now this black is slightly tinted to the blue side, so it's about 70% ultramarine blue and about 30% burnt umber. Normally a real pitch black would be about 60% ultramarine blue and 40% burnt umber, but I've made this one a little more bluish tintage background. I don't really want it to be stark black, so it's a blue-black background I've made up. I make my own blacks up with usually with 60% ultramarine blue, French ultramarine blue, and 40% burnt umber. In this case, I've put a bit more blue into it, so it's about 70% French ultramarine blue and about 30% burnt umber. So it's got a real dark blue tint to it instead of just pitch black. And that's basically what black is. Ivory black in a tube is basically 40% burnt umber and 60% French ultramarine blue. That's what ivory blue is in a tube when you go to the art shop. So I've made my own black up here with more towards the blue side than the brown side. Because if you do 50-50 burnt umber, French ultramarine blue, you'll get more on the brown side black. But I want it to be a bit more blue side. I added a little bit of titanium white to the end down there, just to make it a bit more misty. Add a bit of intrigue to it. Now on the right of that, the background, will be a red curtain. I'm going to just add a little bit of interest a bit. So I've made up the background in the foreground. It's basically on a table. It's a blue vase on a table with some apples. So I'm just working that in. And this is an acrylics, by the way. These are artist quality acrylics. And the brushes are from Rosemary & Co. And I've got all the details about the brushes I use and the paints I use in the description box. So here's the curtain. I'm going to do the background curtain. It's basically permanent alizarin crimson with a little bit of French ultramarine blue to darken it, but not too much French ultramarine blue because it'll go purple. And later on, to darken it even more, I'll use a bit of burnt umber. So it's got to be permanent alizarin crimson, because if it's not permanent alizarin crimson, it will fade, because crimson is a fugitive colour. As long as it's permanent alizarin crimson, it won't fade out in the future. But I use a permanent alizarin crimson as my main red for everything. And if we want to make it red a lot lighter and brighter, you just add yellow to that. Now again, I'm using another flat brush, probably about a size 12 flat brush, long head flat brush, as opposed to a short head flat brush. Long head flat brush, it's not so sharp. Here I am putting the darkest in here. I've added a little bit of French ultramarine blue to the alizarin crimson, but not too much, because you don't want it to go purple, because red and blue is purple. And so if I want to darken even more, I'll add a bit of burnt umber to that. I'm just following the contours of the curtain here, just adding shade where I need it, and then I'll go back and add the light colours and the highlights later. To lighten it up a bit, I might add a little bit of cadmium yellow light where it needed in the highlight areas, and then I'll use a bit of titanium white as well just to bring out a little bit of brightness in the curtain. Now I can bring back some of the lights into it because it's a little bit dark. I usually go back and forth all the time. I'll add darks, then I'll add lights, and then I'll add until I feel I'm about right. Keep going back and forth between darks and lights until I feel it's about right for me. Okay, so I'm adding a little bit of titanium white here, because my main white is titanium white. I don't use any other white. Oh, sorry, I bumped that. Just a bit of titanium white here, and I'm using a long-head filbert brush here, just to blend it in. I like the filbert brushes for blending. So I'm adding a little bit of titanium white here, just to brighten the curtain up a bit and lighten it and just blend it in a bit. Now I'm going to do the foreground, which is basically a table, but I've got to paint like a white sheet, and I'm using titanium white, and I'm using a little bit of French ultramarine blue and burnt umber as well. So it's not completely titanium white, as you can see. It's got some French ultramarine blue and some burnt umber mixed in as well, very slightly tinted. And I'll later on go and fill the darker spaces in. So I'm using a long flat head brush, but size 12, just to fill in just to give a base tone. Then I can start putting in the dark parts and then the highlights, just to fill in that blank white. I'm just mixing colour here, and putting on tail just to see if I get it right. Yeah, I've added some French ultramarine blue here, and it's probably a bit too much French ultramarine blue because it looks a little purple, but we'll correct that later on. Just kind of blending that in. That's a good thing about acrylics. You can blend it in. If this is oil painting, blending in is really a no-no. That's a good thing I like about acrylics. You can blend them in. With oils, it's not a good idea to blend them in. It just turns to mud. Just using a filbert brush here. As you can see, I'm using a short head filbert brush here, just to add some dark tones to it where the apples are, because they're going to be green apples, a blue vase and green apples. So just adding the dark tones here. And I haven't finished yet. I'll leave this part I'm doing right to the end of the painting. I'll probably just before I sign the painting, I'll come back and darken those tones even more, and even lighten some tones if I have to. I'll just add some tones there, but it won't be finished until I finish the painting. When I've done the rest of the painting, I'll come back and work on that a bit more. Just want to get some tones in there so I can start on the vase and then later on do the apples. Once all those are done, then I can go back to this area here before I sign the painting. Just want to get some tones right with a short filbert brush, about a size 8, I think. Short head filbert brush. Just blending everything in. It's not final until I finish the painting. I'll come back to it as I always do. The foreground is something I always come back to. The background is something I really go back to. Very rarely. The foreground, I'm always playing around with the foreground. Just adding a bit more white there. But I always play around with the foreground. That's just the way I am. Some people spend ages playing around with the background. Usually when I've done the background, I'm done. But the foreground is something I always play around with. When I'm happy with that, I'll get onto the vase. Now I'm just working on the vase here. I'm using a large short head filbert brush, about a size 12. And I'm using French ultramarine blue with burnt umber here, because the vase is a little on the blue is a little on the dark side, and I like using the short head filbert brushes for this type of thing. You get deadly accuracy, and you don't get the sharp edges which you get with a flat brush. The thing about acrylic painting is that it can dry very quickly, and you can get some harsh, sharp edges with acrylic. So you've got to use a filbert brush, a short head filbert brush. It relieves that situation. So a great way to get accuracy without getting those sharp edges is using a short head filbert brush instead of a flat brush. All I'm doing is putting in the base tone, which is a mid-tone between uh, dark and light. So I'll come back and put the darks in, and then usually I finish up with the lights on top of that. So this is basically a mid-tone here of the blue. I've decided to mix up a mid-tone. So these are going to be green apples here. One's going to be cut in half. There's 3 whole green apples, Granny Smith apples. Just filling in little blanks as well. All I'm doing is putting my base tone on there. Once the base tone is in, then I'll start putting the darker blues for the shaded areas and the lighter blues for the lighter areas. And I can use the same brush for those there too as well. Just wipe off the excess with a paper towel and continue to use the same brush. Because I use dirty brushes, as they say. I don't have 100 brushes to use, and well, who would want to clean them up? So yeah, just filling in there. Just going over that to make it more smooth. Once all that's done and I'm happy with it, then I can do the tones, the darks and the lights. And this short head filbert brush is brilliant for this type of thing. It doesn't give you sharp edges, but it also gives you accuracy that a flat brush gives you without those sharp edges, which you don't want. Now I've added some dark tones to that on the one side and light tones on the other. Now I'm going to put some flowers patterns on that vase, which is already on there. After I put the tones in, the darks and the lights, as you can see. And I'm using, again, a short head filbert brush, about a size 8. And I'm using heavy gel gloss. I've added some heavy gel gloss to it as well for the flowers, just to make it stand out a bit more. So I've added about 50% heavy gel gloss to 50% color paint. I've added that into it just to make it stand out a bit more, because it's very hard, because it's a pattern there. It's very hard to make it stand out without that. And I like using heavy gel gloss on things that want to stand out. It's different to a molding paste. Molding paste is something different again. I'll just put the flowers in. At the moment it looks pretty rough. I'm using a long edge filbert brush here, size 6. I like the filbert brushes. I know I've mentioned this before, but I use a lot of filbert brushes. When it comes to acrylics, filbert brushes are better than flat brushes. They don't give you the sharp edges. The cardboard cut up thing, which you've got to be careful about that. Just adding a bit of titanium white to it as well. Now the pink colour is obviously titanium white and permanent alizarin crimson. It looks messy at the moment, but I can tell you it's going to get better. Just bear with me here. And you can see how the heavy gel gloss, it has brought it out a bit more. Without it, it looks kind of flat. That's a good thing about using the heavy gel gloss with it. It doesn't look so flat. Heavy gel gloss is a painting medium. So I'm going back again with another filbert brush, because I love filbert brushes, and I'm going to add some green leaves texture to it, to the pattern on the vase. I make my own greens with French ultramarine blue and cabin yellow light. I don't buy green from the tube, I mix my own. So I'm just mixing colours here. If I want the darker green, just more blue, lighter green, just more yellow. That's pretty much my green tones, really. If I want a really dark green, I'll add burnt umber to that as well. But there's no need for that in this case. So I like mixing my own greens. Again, I'm mixing my own greens here with a mid-tone colour for green. It's French ultramarine blue and cabin yellow light. More on the French ultramarine blue side because I want it a little bit darker mid-tone. I'm putting a mid-tone on here with the short-haired filbert brush again, but size I would say size 8, just to fill it in with a mid-tone. It's probably a little on the dark side, but that's okay because it's going to get a whole lot darker for the sharper, darker edges and a whole lot brighter. So when I get to that stage when I want something to be, I want to make my darks darker and my lights lighter, I'll use a darker mid-tone range here. So it's a fairly dark mid-tone range here for these 3 apples and the half apple up there, which I'll do last. All I'm doing is putting a medium to dark mid-tone in with a filbert brush. It's a short-haired filbert brush. They're really great, like I said, for giving you a lot of coverage and detail without having those sharp edges like a flat brush does. This is why I love filbert brushes. Short-haired and long-haired filbert brushes are really good. I'll use a long-haired filbert brush for the whites and the light colours. So this fills it in really well, you know. And I'll go back and use darker tones when I've done this. So yeah, this part's actually quite fun. Now there's also a half apple up on top of them, so there's 3 whole apples and a half apple left. I'll do the half apple last because it's a bit tricky. So now I've got the mid-tone range, which is a little on the dark side. I'll add some cabin yellow light to that and just blend that in on top. These techniques you probably have a hard time painting in oil with because there's more blending here involved. With oil painting, you'd have to have a whole lot of different colors set aside and just put them on top like that and wait for them to dry. Acrylic painting, you don't really need to do that. You can apply them on top of each other and blend them quite easily. So these techniques may not work so well for oil, but they may work for oil. I don't know. They certainly work well for acrylic painting. A lot of oil painters would see this and they would shun and say, well, that's not what you do. Well, it's not what you do in oil, but it's certainly what you can do in acrylics. That's okay. I've done oil paintings in the past as well. So I'm just adding, I'll go back and forth between dark tones and light tones until I'm fairly happy with it. Then I can add the details and the highlights and all that once that's done. And of course the foreground needs fixing up as well. I always do that last. I'm going back and putting some dark tones in again, and I'll keep going back and forth, putting dark tones in and light tones in until I feel it's about right. And I'll keep going back and forth using filbert brushes, short head filbert brushes, but between size 8 and 6. Once they're done, I'll use the long head filbert brushes for the highlights, adding the white in it. So I'll just keep going back and forth with the filbert brushes, adding darks and lights. Yeah. I like using the short head filbert brushes. So as you can see, I've got some more lights in there. I've added the cabin yellow. Now, at the moment, that yellow looks really bright, but once I start adding the titanium white to that, it's going to really come down. At the moment, the colors and the tones look completely wrong, but bear with me because the tones will come right as soon as I apply the titanium white on it for the highlights and add more darks to them. the tones will come right. At the moment, it looks like the tonal range and the colours are completely wrong. But bear with me. Um, bear with me. I've been doing this for a little while. The tones are going to be spot on at the end, but I can promise you that. I've just still doing the tonal ranges. I've still got to get those lights and brights, and I'll go back and forth, and I'll put more darks and then I'll put some more lights, and I'll keep going until I'm happy with it. Then I can start with the whites and the tonal range, and then I'll completely tone down that harsh yellow. You know, because these are Granny Smith green apples, and at the moment I don't look anything like that. But I have to do this to get the tonal ranges for later on. Prepare myself for success. So bear with me, it's all going to be okay. And of course there's a half apple on top of them as well, and I have to continue with the foreground. So just bear with me, I'm going back and forth again, using a bit more darker green here, with a bit of burnt umber tip to make it a lot darker, and put those highlights in for the dark areas. And of course the apple shapes at the moment, they're not perfect either, so when I put the highlights back and I'll reshape those apples. They look a bit wonky at the moment. That's all good. So things will come right. It's just a process I go through. It looks terrible. Almost up to about 3/4 of the way through it, it starts coming together. As you can see now, it's starting to come together. The tones and yellows are still not quite there, but we're going to work on that. This titanium white is going to even things out and make it more greenish. And it's already starting to do that now. I'm putting the highlights in with a long-haired filbert brush, and I also use a dry brush, a filbert brush, as a scrubbing brush to take off excess white. So I'll use a dry brush technique to scrub it in and take out some excess while using titanium white on a filbert brush here. Now I've got hardly any paint on this filbert brush here. I've got titanium white on it, and it's got hardly any of it on there. And I took most of it off on a paper towel. Now I'll alternate between that and a scrubbing brush, which is completely dry, to take off excess white. Now you see that titanium white now is blending into that yellow, into that green. It's actually killing off that bright harsh yellow, and it's starting to look like a green apple. And the more I work with it, the more it's going to look like that. And here I am adding a little bit of highlight to it. Now I'm using filbert brushes because flat brushes will not work in this case. They may work in oils, but not acrylics, because acrylics, you have sharp edges. It looks like a cutout. And as you can see, the white is starting to kill off that yellow, harsh yellow, and it's blending in and making it more greenish. And it's still a bit more work to do to get that done. And I'll alternate with a scrubbing brush. As you can see here, this is a scrubbing brush, and it's pushing that white into that harsh yellow, and it's going to become more lightish greenish. See how it's changing now? I'm using a completely dry brush called scrubbing. It's a scrubbing technique. It's actually called dry brush, but I'm using a scrubbing technique. Now it's starting to come together. And I'm putting a bit more white back in the highlights again on that yellow. And as you can see, the green, that harsh yellow, is disappearing. Now I'm going to paint this half apple here. And again, the tonal range is going to look completely wrong. But bear with me. It's just a tonal range to start off with, just to get rid of that harsh white. All I want to do is fill that area, and then from there I can work on darks and lights and get the tonal ranges correct. But as you can see, those green apples, they have really started to look more like a green apple now. And this is a half apple. Half apples are hard to paint. I mean, they frustrate me, and I don't know why. They're just hard to paint. I've added some cadmium yellow light and some titanium white at the moment. And there I am, added more detail to it and put a bit more burnt umber on that half apple there, just to get it looking a little more like it's been a couple of hours old. Adding the highlights, getting those highlights in, because that's all it is. It's really not a lot of work there. All I'm doing now is just putting the details, the dark areas all around the edges of every apple, and just blend it in, but not too hard. You don't want to press too hard. All I have to do now is fix up this foreground, which is, I'm always messing with the foreground. For some reason, I keep coming back to the foreground and playing with it. Here I am playing with the foreground again, and I'll go back between this darker color and this and white, back and forth like this here, with the dark and the light brushes. The white brush has got hardly any on it, and the black I use again with my own burn number and ultramarine blue. Here I am, I'm signing the painting. I've decided enough is enough. I finished it, and that should cover that. So it's about 3 hours long. I hope you enjoyed the painting. Like, share, subscribe, and bang that bell for much more videos and updates. And we'll catch you later, eh? And I hope you enjoyed the video. And cheers, and have a great day.